Good morning, everyone. This is the Act 142 broadband update from the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. We do have a couple of housekeeping items before we get into the webinar. We do ask that you keep yourself on mute throughout the presentation so that we can limit background noise. And then if you have any questions, feel free to place those in the chat box that you can find in the Zoom ribbon. We will either get to those questions throughout the presentation before we move on to a different topic, or answer them and address them at the end of the presentation. So for today's webinar, I'll first introduce myself. My name is Landon Masters, and I'm the Community Outreach and Communications Manager here at the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff, or the ORS. We have a couple of our staff folks that will be attending and speaking on today's webinar that can shed some light on the programs that we are administering through Act 142. First being our Executive Director, Nanette Edwards, Chris Rosicki, our Broadband Project Administrator. Tom Allen is our Director of Safety, Transportation, and Telecommunications. Casey Sims is our Outreach Coordinator. Brittany Waring, our Legislative Liaison and Executive Assistant. And then Amy Marshall, our Manager of Finance and Administration. So each of these folks will be available to answer questions, and some of them will be presenting slides during the webinar today. We'll first start off with our Executive Director, Nanette Edwards, who will give a little bit of information about what the Office of Regulatory Staff is, if you don't already know, and then some information about Act 142.
Thank you, Landon. Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this webinar. Let me just take a moment and introduce myself. I am Nanette Edwards, and I'm the Executive Director for the South Carolina Office of Regulatory Staff. I joined ORS in 2005 after spending 10 years in the telecommunications industry. So it actually came in handy as we go through the broadband slides and the work that we've been doing most recently in broadband. And let me just start with a few words about the Office of Regulatory Staff. So ORS was formed in 2004 pursuant to Act 175. And we perform the staff functions that used to be performed by the Public Service Commission of South Carolina. So we represent the public interest before the South Carolina Public Service Commission in utility regulation. That includes electric, natural gas, telecommunications that continues to be regulated, water, wastewater, and transportation. Transportation, you may think of taxi cabs, household good movers, Uber, and Lyft. So we represent that public interest not just before the PSC, but also through the court system, federal regulatory bodies, and before any other administrative agencies that we may deal with. So moving to the next slide, Act 142 became effective June 25th of this year. Now, up until then, ORS really had no involvement with broadband as a broadband service, if you will. But Act 142 allocated $50 million of the CARES money, the Coronavirus Relief Fund for South Carolina under that CARES Act to ORS to further certain broadband initiatives due to the COVID-19 pandemic. And in particular, of that $50 million, we utilized what we saw, the work that was being done through the governor's office, and in working with their reports and their information, we looked at setting aside roughly $20 million for hotspots and monthly internet service for qualifying student households, a budget of $300,000 for the mapping of existing broadband in South Carolina so that we can see where we are and where we are not. And then finally, $29.7 million for infrastructure. This would be new infrastructure in unserved areas of South Carolina, bringing broadband to those unserved areas. So that's where we started on June 25th, 2020, and of course a lot has happened since that time. Others will go into each of these programs in more detail. I'm going to start with mapping, which is our next slide. And with regard to mapping, where we are is we have secured a vendor for the development of a statewide mapping plan, and we have been receiving information from different broadband providers in the state today as to where they are currently providing service. We are coming to a close on that data collection process. I'm actually hoping to close it today or tomorrow, as a matter of fact. And our plan is to have the map completed by the end of November. The vendors that we have selected is CopQuest Associates. As I mentioned, the surveys went out to all the providers. We have wonderful support from leadership. We had a letter from Governor McMaster, as well as from Senator Leatherman and Representative Merle Smith. So with that support from leadership, I would say that our response has been very good. We have only a very few number of entities that have not yet responded as of this morning. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Landon to allow others to go into more detail about the various program initiatives that are underway.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Nanette. Next, we're going to move on to the online learning initiative portion of these broadband funds. And I will remind folks that if you have questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. I placed a little note there, but we can address those during the presentations or at the end during the Q&A. So I'm going to turn it over to Casey Sims to talk a little bit more about the online learning initiative.
Thank you, Landon. As Landon mentioned, my name is Casey Sims. I have been with the Office of Regulatory Staff for about 3 years now. I joined in 2017. And prior to joining ORS, I actually was in education. And so I taught in the classroom for about 4 years, and was actually able to understand some of the challenges that were going to be experienced due to COVID-19 as far as virtual learning goes. A big bulk of that, like I said, would be virtual learning, and the concern would be internet access for a lot of folks. So in an effort to provide relief to those student households, ORS was tasked with procuring mobile hotspots and monthly internet service for qualifying student households through December 31st of 2020. Like I said, this was intended to provide relief to those student households that did not have internet, but due to COVID-19 were expected to do their virtual learning at home and carry out their schooling while at home. And you can move to the next slide, Landon. So to qualify for monthly internet service or to receive a mobile hotspot, one did have to meet the qualifications. To qualify, the household had to have an annual income of 250% of the federal poverty level or less, as well as attend a public or private K-12 school or public or private university, college, or technical college. And also not have existing internet in their home. We began accepting orders, and to basically place an order, the school district or the institution had to place an order, fill out an order form, and they had to collect their data, basically coming up with the number of hotspots that they needed based on qualifying student households that they had. They would place their order for that amount and then send that order to us, and we would place the order with the vendor. The mobile hotspots were shipped to those schools or the districts, and they were actually in charge of distributing them to those student households. When we began taking orders, we actually did open it up to priority schools and districts first. To be a priority school, those schools fell in counties that contained, basically defined by the Department of Education as having a poverty rate greater than or equal to 86%. There was about 22 priority public schools that we had, school districts, and they were given priority. Their orders were placed first. There were about 29 colleges or universities or tech schools that had students that lived in those priority counties. And then there were 2 private schools that fell in a county, and their orders were placed first as well. So we did give them priority, and then after that we opened it up to all the other schools and districts in the state at that time. All right. So basically, ORS has been working very hard during these last few months, and a lot of work has been done. And within the first 6 weeks of Act 142 being signed, ORS actually created a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, which was the agreement between ORS and the school districts or the institutions, basically verifying that schools would only distribute those hotspots to student households that met those qualifications. We also created order forms for school districts to use to place their orders. That being order form for mobile hotspots, we had to create an order form for wireline. So we created those. We created order forms for priority, non-priority, higher education, and those public school districts. We also had to create monthly reporting documents. These are collected monthly to help keep track of each mobile hotspot, if they're still being used, the address they are at, and these are turned in and kept monthly. And then we also created communication materials such as press releases, program overviews, tutorials were done, how to fill out that monthly reporting, program one-pagers, basically just to give an overview of the program, and those were sent out and also posted on our website as well. So basically, within a short amount of time, a lot of work was done and has not stopped. So we've been working really hard these past few months, and we'll continue to do so. So if you take a look at this chart, this is a breakdown of our numbers thus far. So if you look, we accepted orders from public school districts, private schools, charter schools, and then higher education institutions. Totaling, we had 115 participants place orders total between each of those different categories. So right now, between our mobile hotspots and wired orders, we are right over 92,000 orders placed at this point in time. That number is ever changing because we are still accepting orders. There's some onesies and twosies coming in. There are orders being swapped right now. We're still discovering areas that mobile hotspots really aren't the best fit in some areas, so we're doing what we can to see if wireline is available in those areas. And then also, as mobile hotspots go missing or walk off, we're also handling those replacements or what needs to be done in those situations. So that number is ever changing, but at this time, that's what we have. We did have Verizon, AT&T, and T-Mobile as the mobile hotspots providers, and then for wired line, I do believe it was about 10 different companies for wired line as well. We have placed, as of now, roughly over 250 orders from July until now. And like I said, orders are still trickling in. So it's been a lot of orders that we have been taking in. As of now, that's pretty much it as far as online learning goes. I will turn it back over to Landon. I know there may be some questions, which we'll be happy to answer towards the end.
Yeah, so I think before we move on to the next section, we do have a question specific about the online learning initiative. Colleen asked if there's been any discussion about extending the service beyond December of this year.
And it looks like Department of Education will be able to pick up service from January to June. Details and logistics are still being worked out at this time. So we're working that out, and more information will be coming soon. At this time, we do know, that will be picked up, but as far as the logistics, that's still being worked out.
Thank you. Yeah, I know that has been a big question on folks' mind about what happens after that December 31st. And I know that a lot of discussion has been going in to try to make that work for those folks that definitely need that service after the end of the year. So it's great to hear. So next we'll move on to the Broadband Infrastructure Program. And we have Chris Rozicki, our broadband contact guru here in the office that some of you may know or have spoken with, and he's going to give us a little bit more information about that program.
Hi all, Chris Rozicki here. I started with ORS back in 2008 after a fairly long career in telecommunications, 25 years in telecommunications, and before that a few years in other regulated entities. As a little background to my experience before ORS. I am the broadband projects administrator here, and right now I'm handling all of the infrastructure projects that are going on within the state. Initially, we were allocated $29 million and change in CARES funding to build out broadband into those areas in the state that were currently unserved. And we defined unserved as receiving broadband at your home at less than 25.3 or the established broadband rate by the FCC. So that was, we were looking to entice broadband vendors, providers, to identify shovel-ready projects that they could build in a very short period of time and bring broadband to some of the unserved areas or portions of the state. The next slide, Landon. One of the first things we did is work with a company, Revolution D, to identify all of the areas in the state that are served and unserved and the speeds or levels at which they are served. Revolution D had been preparing some maps, and they've done an excellent job of providing maps which really identify across the state using a number of sources, FCC data and Ookla speed test data. They develop maps that show where broadband is available, where speeds are very fast, where it is not available, or speeds are slow, or completely unavailable. With the help of Revolution D, we identified 550 areas in the state where broadband at some level was unavailable. Those areas were defined on the map that you're looking at by the squares that are on the map. Each square was 6 miles by 6 miles in size. And each of those squares contains at least some area that is unserved. In some cases, 50% is well served, 50% is unserved, and it varies up and down from there. So the idea was, by identifying these areas, we would encourage broadband service providers to propose that they could serve those areas in a fairly quick time period. And by quick time period, we define that as building out and making service available prior to December 18th of 2020, a date that's fast approaching. In addition to the 550 areas that we identified, there were 150 plus high priority areas where there was either a large low income contingent or there was virtually no broadband available at all. Next slide, Graham. So in developing the program for this infrastructure, we created an overview of the program. We developed various press releases to go out announcing the program. We developed here an application form so that companies could submit applications to us. And knowing that we had a very limited time frame, we tried to make the application as simple and straightforward as possible. We also prepared guidelines that gave what we think were fairly clear instructions as to how companies would apply for a grant, if you will, or for funding to build out their broadband network. We also developed a funding agreement and some reporting tools. Our program uses the 29 million plus that I mentioned from CARES and is a matching program. So a company deciding that it wanted to build a particular area would need to match our funding at a 50% rate. So if the build was $1 million project, or the CARES funding would provide $500,000 to the project, and the company itself would have to provide the other $500,000 in investment. We solicited applications for expanding broadband infrastructure into these unserved areas. The applicants would then use the guidelines to apply. They would complete their applications and submit them, and that has all been done. After ORS reviewed and scored each application, we began working with the applicants to finalize funding agreements so that their planning and construction could begin immediately. All these projects, as I mentioned before, needed to be completed by December 18th of this year. Next slide. To help with our management and to make it clear to all companies applying, we developed basically a timeline for when things needed to be delivered, done. You can see here that we opened up the program on August 5th. That's when the application period began or opened. We also opened a challenge process during that period, on that same date, if you will. And the challenge period closed 7 days later on August 12th. And then you can see at each step where deliverables were due. We moved very quickly. We needed to do this in order to get everything completed by the end of the year. Next slide. So how did it all play out? We got applications from 14 companies, which we thought was excellent. Those applications, there were over 80 actual applications. 76 of those ultimately were funded. Those 76 projects cover 27 counties. And if we go back to the map showed 550 project areas and 150 priority target areas. In those areas, we covered 57 of the target areas and specifically 35 of the priority target areas with construction projects. Those of you pulling out your calculators and doing the math may notice that there are more target areas that we are serving than actual projects that were funded, the 76, and that's just because some projects were large enough to encompass multiple target areas. Just an interesting little tidbit. Ultimately, we pushed out $25.5 million in funding, so there's still some funding that's available. That over $25 million in funding is actually going to allow us to pass with either fiber to the home, fiber to the premises, or HFC, hybrid fiber coax, over 25,000 homes, businesses, healthcare facilities, community anchor institutions, and schools. Nearly all of these were previously unserved by broadband. And with that, I conclude my section and give it back to you, Landon.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. So I don't see any specific questions to the broadband infrastructure program at this time in the chat box, but continue to put those in there if you have them. I'm going to go quickly back to the online learning initiative because we did have one question come in about that. So Casey, if you could maybe handle this one. Ray asked, do we know how many students are not participating in the online learning initiative program because of the lack of connectivity?
Hi, thank you for that question. I can't say that we know the number of students that are not. Thank you for that question. I'm sorry, we were on mute. We didn't realize. Thank you for that question. So I can't say that we know the amount of students not participating in the program due to connectivity, but I can say that we did get that feedback that was an issue for some folks. Connectivity was an issue. So what we did on our end was worked it out as best we could. There were a couple of things that we would try, and I can give you a couple of examples, but I know in Greenville County, connectivity was an issue, and we actually were able to get a stronger device ordered for that specific household, and I never heard back from that district regarding that, so I'm assuming that worked out for them. And that actually happened in another county as well. I do believe it was Oconee County. In addition to trying a stronger hotspot, we also, and I'm glad you brought this up because I should have mentioned it previously, but we did have to amend our original MOU, which originally stated that only one device was allowed per household. We went back and amended that to basically state that we would allow more than one in situations that it was needed. So, for example, If there were 6 students in one household, and, obviously streaming your virtual school would be a struggle for all of them. At one time, in those specific situations, we would allow more than one in that household. So school districts were allowed to sign that amended MOU and send that back to us, and then they were allowed, to allow more than one per household. And then also we did encourage them to reach out in regards to wireline service if connectivity was an issue as well. We would look into that address and see if they were able to be served with a wireline company. And I will say, if not, we did take down their address and pass it along to the infrastructure team so that we were aware that that address was not being served or was not able to be served. So we did not have a specific number of students that were not able to participate because of connectivity, but we do know that that was an issue for some, and we worked it out as best we could for those specific situations. Thank you for that question.
Awesome. Yeah. And I know that you guys are continuing to work through a lot of those specific situations and find solutions for those households. So thank you for that. We do have a question about the broadband infrastructure program, asking about if there's a list of the counties and priority target areas available.
So this is Chris again. Yes, there's the counties are available on our website on the www.ors.sc.gov. There's a broadband section there, and you can browse through there. So we have a list of the counties. The map that we showed earlier in the presentation is also available on the website, and that map shows all the 550, I think it's 557 target areas in the state. I think red boxes are the priority areas, and the yellow boxes are the high priority or areas. So that map is available on our website.
And two, if there are specific questions, they can reach out to myself or the contact information for the broadband program that is on the website as well. There's an email there to submit questions to. And Aaron is asking to clarify, it looks at like just over 10% of the 550 6x6 mile target areas will be served through the infrastructure program. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes and no. So these projects some of them were very, very small, as few as 7 customers connected in a project. So an area that's 6x6 that may be somebody proposed serving 7 customers in there, it may not have covered all of the unserved potential customers in the area. Projects varied in size from, as I say, as little as 7 customers to as many as several thousand customers. Some project areas were very well served, and the project area may be completely covered, but some only portions of it. So the entire 6 mile by 6 mile box may not have been covered by a particular project. Landon, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. And continue to put those questions in the chat box and we'll get to those. Now we're going to move on to some of the financials and updates about the financing side of the program or our initiatives. And Amy Marshall is going to talk about that. We've kind of touched on a little bit of these throughout the presentation, but this will give you a good overview and snapshot of where we are right now financially with the broadband funding. So Amy?
Thank you, Landon, and good morning, everyone. As Landon said, my name is Amy Marshall. I'm the Finance and Administration Manager here at ORS. I joined ORS in February of this year. I came from the private sector with a background in accounting, finance, financial planning, and analysis. I want to start off, before I start talking about the dollars, I want to start off by saying that ORS staff, since the end of June, when Act 142 was signed, ORS staff has spent close to 4,000 hours to date on implementing Act 142. I expect will be between 4,500 to 5,000 hours total by the end of December once the projects all finish up. We have, prior to starting all of the projects, Casey mentioned the MOUs that we have with the online learning. Chris mentioned the funding agreements that we have with the participants on the broadband infrastructure piece. We worked very closely with the Executive Budget Office and with Guidehouse. Guidehouse, they're a consulting firm that the state hired to help with the CARES Act funds and ensure that the state is using those funds in accordance of the law. So ORS worked very closely with the Executive Budget Office and Guidehouse to ensure we're spending the funds accordingly and that we have sufficient documentation for all the monies spent on our end, and that's the MOUs that we wrote and got executed, the funding agreements, the required monthly reporting for the school districts, and that report has to be certified by each head of the institution, head of the school district. So a lot of these documentations isn't to make life difficult for the participants. It's really to make sure we're crossing our T's and dotting our I's and spending these monies appropriately and accordingly, and have the backup to do so. So on to mapping. As Nanette mentioned, we contracted with CostQuest on this. It came right at the monies that we allocated towards this initiative. And as she also indicated, that should be finishing up here, very soon. And I would anticipate receiving the invoice from CostQuest, by the end of this month, by the end of November. See, I already think it's November. Next slide, please, Landon. On the online learning initiative, ORS allocated $20 million to this initiative. As of today, our estimate of what we believe this is going to cost to procure the hotspots, to procure whatever wired service we needed to procure, and the wireless service through the end of December, our estimate is that we're going to come in right over $13.7 million for this initiative. It's our current estimate, as Casey mentioned in her section. We're still getting orders in for wired service. We're still getting, issues where hotspots have been lost and we're having to replace those. So that number is fluctuating. So far to date, we have received invoices from the providers totaling close to $6.7 million. Obviously, a lot of the big chunk of the funds are up front because of purchasing the devices for the mobile hotspots. Our AP department are folks, they're busy processing, invoices for payment. We also are requiring monthly reports, as Casey mentioned, for each participant, and this is to account for all the devices. This was also a recommendation from Guidehouse to ensure that ORS has the proper documentation to spend these funds. And this week, October reports will be going out. I do want to take a minute to discuss the contracts that we have with our partners on this initiative. ORS worked to execute very reasonable rates with the providers that we have. We executed 13 contracts with these providers, and in those contracts, we allowed for the service to be transferred, because the CARES Act funding for us ends in December, according to the current state of that. So we allowed for those devices and that service at those rates that we negotiated to be transferred to the various schools and institutions. Our partners on this initiative have been phenomenal to work with. They have done a great job fulfilling the orders, getting hotspots out to the districts and the institutions, and getting the wired service where needed. Next slide, please, Landon. On the Broadband Infrastructure Program, we allocated $29.7 million towards that. Planning was $6,000, and that was Revolution D. As Chris stated, we've committed $25.5 million of that with the signed applications. The participants, we're requiring some documentation for the participants. We require monthly financial reporting. We actually require them to submit the expenses that they're incurring on these projects. Last week, we held a webinar with the participants to discuss the monthly reporting, to discuss, submitting project expenses and their invoicing requirements that is needed. And the goal for that is consistency in preparing the reporting and the submittals that the participants are going to submit to us to facilitate ORS's review and approval of the progress and ultimate payment of their invoices as they submit their invoices. Chris mentioned that this is a cost share project. ORS did, however, put in a clawback provision in the funding agreement. So that provision is, as Chris explained, if a project was $1 million, ORS, using the CARES funds money, would fund $500,000 of that project. However, if the participant had cost savings and their cost came in at $800,000 rather than $1 million for the total cost of the project, then they would then reimburse the state, basically ORS, and then it gets reimbursed up through the chain to the Executive Budget Office, $100,000. So ORS's share of that project should have only been $400,000, but with the cost savings, we're able to get some of that money, that CARES funds back. So that we are requiring them to submit all of their invoices showing what they're spending on the projects, and only those costs directly related to the broadband implementation are allowed for these projects. And again, this came about with rounds and rounds of conversations to make sure that we are spending those monies correctly and in accordance with the law. We are requiring monthly financial reports, and in each financial report, they tell us in the funding applications, each participant identified the number of locations to be passed within. Chris mentioned it was over 25,000 with this. So, in their monthly financial reports, we ask that they tell us, hey, as of November 1, how many you said you would pass 1,000, how many have you passed thus far? I anticipate project billing will really begin mid to late November. We've only had billings totaling about $350,000 thus far. The way the funding agreement is written, participants can have milestones that they designate. So as they are reaching these milestones, then they are able to turn around and invoice us. And then those invoices go through a very thorough review and approval process on ORS's side. And all final reports, financial reports, invoices, project expenses related are due to ORS no later than December 19th. And with that, Landon, I turn it back to you. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amy. So that was an overview of where we are at currently. I will say that it is a snapshot of where we're at. A lot of the folks on today's presentation mentioned that it's an ever-moving target, and those numbers are changing every single day. So we wanted to give an update to make sure that we were keeping folks informed and the public informed as well. So I'll open it up right now to other questions that folks may have. Feel free to put those in the chat box, and then you can. I know we have a lot of participants that are just participating via phone audio, so you are able to unmute yourself, and I believe that is by clicking *6. So if you do have a question, feel free to unmute yourself via *6 if you're just calling in by phone, or via the Zoom platform if you're on your computer. So we did get a question from Sarah asking for the plans for the remaining funds at the end of this year. I don't know who wants to address that.
Hey, this is Amy. Good morning, Sarah. Thank you for the question. The plans for the remaining funds right now, those funds are not ORS's funds. So those funds will be returned. Well, we don't even have the money in our agency at this point anyway. It's as we spend it do those funds come to us. So that money will revert back to the executive budget office, at the end of the project.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. So if there are any other questions, folks on the phone or via Zoom, if you want to unmute yourself or put those in the chat. Again, *6 if you're calling in via the phone. So I don't have any other questions in the chat box. And hopefully we have answered a lot of those questions that folks may have had, and gave a great update about what's going on here at the ORS in terms of administering broadband funding through Act 142 and the CARES Act funds. This is all of our contact information up here on the screen right now. So feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions about what's going on with broadband. And we did have one more question that came through. What's the plan for the unallocated funds? Amy had said that those funds right now they're with the executive budget office, correct? And they would go back.
Correct. Those are not ORS's funds.
Awesome. Great. So if any other questions, feel free to reach out to us. But with that, we will conclude today's webinar. And we thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to get an update on broadband and Act 142 with the Office of Regulatory Staff. Have a great rest of your day.